The boardroom lights hummed with a sterile, predatory energy that made my skin crawl. Dominic adjusted his silk tie while sliding the termination papers across the polished mahogany. My patent is worth $1.2 billion. The CEO's son claimed my life's work and fired me in the boardroom. I just asked Are you sure you read section 17.8? He raised his champagne like he just won the lottery. I just smiled. Enjoy your celebration. Sunrise is going to be interesting. He laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. I gathered my tablet and felt the cold weight of 17 years compressed into a single briefcase. None of the senior developers looked up from their screens. They were cowards, paralyzed by the Scott family's wealth and influence. I walked toward the elevator, while the champagne corks popped behind me. The sound echoed like small, celebratory gunshots in the hallway. My access badge flickered from blue to black as I stepped into the lobby. Dominic had already deactivated my primary digital existence before the ink dried. The city lights flickered through the rain as I sat in my darkened apartment. My personal server hummed in the corner, a silent companion in the shadows. I opened a terminal and ran a final diagnostic on the encryption seed. Everything was live and pulsing with a digital heartbeat. Back in 2008, Tanner and I built a legal tripwire specifically for this betrayal. We called it the Dual Authentication Protocol. If the Federal Registry didn't receive my signature, the ownership would revert. At midnight, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. It was a burner call from a trembling lawyer in the corporate legal department. She whispered that Dominic was forging my digital signature to finalize the Chinese merger. I thanked her and leaned back into the velvet chair. The countdown on my screen showed 4 hours until the automated override. Dominic was busy signing away property he didn't own to investors who didn't exist. He thought he was a king, but he was just a ghost. The first light of dawn painted the skyline in shades of bruised purple and gold. I watched the redwood building through my binoculars as the tower began to flicker. Systematic sequences triggered across the global banking grid. Every monitor in their headquarters suddenly flashed a stark white screen. Federal Registry override activated. Authorized owner Scarlett. 17 years of work vanished from Dominic's control in 90 seconds. The stock ticker below the morning news began a vertical, terrifying drop into the red. I drove to the ground floor coffee shop to watch the final collapse in person. Sirens wailed as black SUVs swerved toward the main entrance. Federal agents stepped out with heavy tactical gear and warrant folders. Dominic appeared at the glass doors, his face a mask of pale, sweating terror. He looked at the crowd and saw me holding a simple black coffee. I didn't wave or shout. I just watched as the handcuffs clicked shut over his expensive watch. The sun was finally high enough to burn. Dominic's knees hit the pavement before the agents reached him. I stepped closer, the bitter steam of my coffee rising into the cold air. The crowd of commuters surged forward, their phones recording the heir's public shaming. He looked up and caught my reflection in the glass door. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind him, the lobby's digital ticker display froze on a red error code. My phone buzzed with a frantic message from Tanner Cooper. He tried to bypass the federal vault manually, Tanner said. I could hear the sharp clatter of a keyboard in the background. The logic gates I built in 2008 were holding steady against the clumsy intrusion. Dominic had sent a junior engineer into the server basement to force a hard override. This was rookie desperation at its finest. My technology was a fortress, and the thief didn't have the keys. The agent standing over Dominic pulled a heavy gold envelope from his pocket. The officer unfolded the federal warrant with a slow, deliberate snap. It named Dominic and his father as primary suspects in a $1 billion securities fraud investigation. Richard Scott appeared in the glass frame, his face gray and sunken. He grabbed the door handle, but the electronic lock remained engaged. The Dawn Protocol had sealed the entire perimeter of the building. My code had effectively turned the skyscraper into a high-tech prison. Richard stared at me through the reinforced glass. "Open the doors." "Scarlett." Richard's voice crackled through the external intercom. I didn't move an inch toward the keypad. Instead, I checked the real-time valuation of the Redwood stock. It was currently trading at pennies per share. The Chinese acquisition deal was officially dead in the water. I held up my tablet so the CEO could see the catastrophic graph. His eyes widened as he realized the magnitude of his son's failure. The stock ticker behind him finally went dark. The federal agents smashed the glass door with a heavy hydraulic ram. Shards of crystal rained down like diamonds on the expensive lobby carpet. Richard was pulled to the ground alongside his trembling son. I walked past the wreckage, my boots crunching on the broken remains of their legacy. The scent of ozone and burnt electronics filled the air. A lead investigator stopped me with a gloved hand. He needed my master key to unlock the national defense databases. "The system requires my biometric signature," I told the officer quietly. He nodded and led me toward the central terminal. I watched the backup power generators kick in with a low, mechanical hum. The emergency lights bathed the room in a deep, warning crimson. I felt no pity for the men being dragged away in chains. This was the natural conclusion of their greed. I placed my thumb on the scanner and waited for the final confirmation beep. The terminal screen glowed green as the federal override synchronized with my key. Sentinel Shield was back in my control, but the company was a hollow shell. I turned to see the junior engineer who had tried to break my code. He was standing in the corner, clutching a laptop and shaking with fear. I realized then that Redwood wasn't just a building or a stock price. It was a graveyard of stolen ideas. The boy handed me an encrypted drive. I gripped the drive, its cold casing biting into my palm. The junior engineer, Ethan. It looked like he might collapse under the weight of his own betrayal. He whispered that Dominic had ordered a secret mirror site. This meant my code was being siphoned to an offshore server in real time. The Dawn Protocol had locked the building, but the data was still leaking through a dark fiber connection. I had to kill the transmission before the encryption keys reached the dark web. The federal agents swarmed the server racks, but they were looking for physical evidence. They didn't understand the invisible theft happening behind the blinking blue lights. I pushed past a technician and plugged the encrypted drive into the master console. The interface flickered, showing a hidden outbound stream directed at a shell company in Macau. My pulse spiked as the progress bar hit 90%. Dominic had been smarter than I realized. He had built a backdoor into my own basement. "Get away from that terminal." A deep voice boomed from the shadows. Richard Scott stood there, disheveled but still holding a heavy security override card. He had escaped the initial sweep by hiding in the executive restroom. His hand shook as he swiped the card, attempting to force a hard reboot of the central core. If the system restarted now, the security protocols would reset to factory defaults. I lunged for the manual kill switch located under the primary desk. The struggle was brief and pathetic. Richard tripped over a tangle of cooling cables, his expensive suit tearing on a metal bracket. I slammed the kill switch down with the heel of my hand. The servers let out a dying whine as the power vanished. The mirror site transmission cut off at 99%. Silence settled over the room like thick dust. I stared at the dark screen, waiting for the backup lights to engage. Richard groaned on the floor. Red emergency lights pulsed, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the server blades. The federal lead investigator returned, his boots echoing on the raised floor tiles. He looked at the downed system and then at the broken man at my feet. The agents had finally secured the building's perimeter. They were ready to take the physical servers for forensic analysis. But the drive Ethan gave me contained a secret that changed everything. It wasn't just code. It was a recorded confession. I opened the file on my tablet, letting the audio play for the room. Dominic's voice filled the space, arrogant and clear. He was discussing the forgery of my signature with the Chinese investors. He explicitly mentioned that his father had approved the theft to save the family name. Richard went still, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The subtext of their greed was now a matter of public record. The investigator took the tablet and nodded to his team. "We have everything we need," the officer said. He pulled Richard up and began reciting his rights in a flat, monotone voice. I watched them disappear into the elevator, leaving me alone in the dark. The building was empty of life, but the air still felt heavy with lingering lies. I checked the drive one last time and found a hidden directory. It was a list of every developer Dominic had blackmailed over the years. The fallout was just beginning. I stared at the blackmail list as the screen flickered. These names represented the silent backbone of Redwood Industries. Brilliant minds were crushed under Dominic's thumb for years. I realized the scope of the rot went deeper than a single patent theft. This list was my leverage to rebuild what they destroyed. I heard a soft click behind me in the shadows. Someone was still inside the server room. A tall figure stepped into the dim emergency light. It was Beverly Anders, the company's lead counsel. Her professional suit was wrinkled, and her eyes looked exhausted. She held a physical folder close to her chest. I expected a legal threat or a plea for mercy. Instead, she laid the folder on the cooling rack between us. It contained the original Section 17.8, addendum with Tanner's handwritten notes. Beverly had kept the only physical copy hidden from the Scott family for over a decade. "Richard tried to make me shred this yesterday," Beverly whispered. Her voice was thin but steady. She had witnessed the theft and finally reached her breaking point. The document proved the dual authentication protocol was a permanent condition of my employment. It meant the board could never legally vote to strip my rights away. This was the final nail for the Scott family's legal defense. I reached for the folder, but Beverly didn't let go yet. "There is a secondary trigger you forgot, Scarlett," she warned. She pointed to a clause buried in the fine print. If the Federal Registry flagged a forgery, the patent didn't just revert. It entered a mandatory 90-day cooling-off period under government escrow. During this time, the technology was considered a matter of national security. I wouldn't be able to license it to anyone. My plan to start my own firm was suddenly on ice. The weight of the complication settled heavily in my chest. I had the technology back, but I couldn't use it. The federal agents began hauling the physical servers out. Every piece of hardware was now government evidence. I watched as months of potential revenue vanished into a black van. Without the ability to license Sentinel Shield, my new company would starve. I needed a way to bypass the escrow without breaking federal law. I turned back to the master console one last time. Ethan was still huddled in the corner, watching me intently. He mentioned the mirror site in Macau again. If a version of the code existed outside the Federal Registry, it wasn't subject to escrow. It was a legal loophole large enough to drive a truck through. I just needed to retrieve the final 1% of the data. The problem was the Macau server required a physical bypass. I looked at the encrypted drive Ethan had given me. It wasn't just a record of Dominic's crimes. It contained the IP address for the Macau facility. I realized the game had moved from a boardroom to a global stage. The Scotts were finished, but the technology was still at risk. I had to reach that server before the Chinese investors sent their own recovery team. My phone buzzed with an alert. A private jet was idling on the tarmac. The airport tarmac shimmered under a cold, predatory sun. I clutched the encrypted drive as I approached the sleek Gulf Stream. The pilot didn't ask for a passport, he just tapped the Scott family insignia on his jacket. Dominic had booked this flight to facilitate his illegal data handoff. I was stepping into a trap designed for a thief. The cabin smelled of expensive leather and desperation. I realized I was flying on the enemy's dime to save my own soul. The engines roared, masking the frantic heartbeat in my chest. I opened my laptop and scanned the Macau server coordinates once more. The physical bypass required a hardware key that Dominic usually wore around his neck. I looked at the floor of the jet and saw a small, discarded velvet pouch. Inside lay a titanium USB stick engraved with the redwood logo. He must have dropped it during his panicked attempt to flee. This was the missing link for the vault. I tried to log into the jet's secure satellite uplink. A red warning banner flashed across my screen immediately. The federal authorities had blacklisted every tail number associated with Redwood Industries. I was currently flying in a vessel flagged for international seizure. If we crossed into foreign airspace, we might be forced down by military interceptors. The pilot looked back, his eyes tight with unspoken fear. He knew the tail number was burning. We had 6 hours of fuel left. "Can you mask our transponder?" I shouted over the engine noise. The pilot shook his head and pointed to the radar screen. A digital shadow was trailing us from the coast. It wasn't the FBI, the signature was private and fast. Dominic's Chinese buyers were tired of waiting for the official transfer. They were coming to collect their earned prize in mid-air. I gripped the titanium key until my knuckles turned white. The hunters had become the hunted. The private interceptor gained ground, its silhouette sharp against the clouds. My satellite connection flickered back to life for one brief second. A message from Beverly Anders appeared on the encrypted channel. She had found a second mirror site hidden in a Vancouver data center. The Macau facility was a decoy designed to lure me out of the country. I had walked right into a geographic shell game. The real data was moving north while I flew east. I pulled the cockpit door open and demanded a course correction. The pilot refused, citing his specific flight plan orders from Richard Scott. He was still loyal to the man who signed his paychecks. I realized then that Richard's reach extended far beyond the server room. The jet began a steep bank toward the open ocean. We were no longer headed to a facility, we were headed to a rendezvous. A black helicopter appeared on our left wing. The helicopter matched our speed with terrifying precision. A side door slid open, revealing a man holding a high-gain wireless receiver. They were going to siphon the data directly from the jet's internal servers. I had the only physical drive, but the cabin's local network was vulnerable. I lunged for the cockpit's master circuit breaker to kill the plane's power. My hand hovered over the lever as the pilot drew a compact pistol. He wasn't just a pilot. The pilot's hand was steady as he aimed the barrel at my chest. He didn't look like a killer, just a man following a contract. I realized the Scott family had deep pockets for loyalty. The cabin pressure dropped as the jet banked harder into the wind. I kept my hand near the circuit breaker, my fingers hovering over the cold metal. The air felt thin and smelled of ozone. The black helicopter matched our speed with a mechanical, predatory grace. One wrong move meant a quiet death at 30,000 feet. "Move away from the panel, Scarlett," the pilot said. His voice was flat, devoid of any personal malice or hesitation. I looked at the titanium key still gripped in my left hand. If I couldn't stop the transmission, I would destroy the hardware itself. I feinted toward the cabin door but lunged for the breaker instead. The lever clicked down with a heavy, satisfying thud. Every light in the cabin vanished instantly. The hum of the satellite link died, leaving us in a terrifying, high-altitude silence. The sudden darkness forced the pilot to squint at his dead instrument panel. He cursed softly as the jet began to lose its trim in the thin air. This was my only window to act before he regained control. I scrambled back toward the passenger seating area, clutching my heavy laptop. The helicopter's spotlight washed over the cabin windows in rhythmic, blinding pulses. They were trying to establish a wireless handshake with the jet's emergency systems. My code was the only thing standing between them and the final encryption keys. I opened my local terminal and triggered the manual wipe on the jet's internal server. If I couldn't have the data, neither would the shadow buyers. The progress bar crawled across the screen in the dim light. Outside, the man in the helicopter raised a specialized receiver toward our wing. A sudden jolt rocked the plane as the pilot engaged the backup batteries. Power flooded back into the cockpit, and the digital screens flickered to life. The pilot turned his seat, his face contorted with cold, focused rage. "You just killed the engine sink," he hissed. The plane shuddered as the right turbine began to whine at a dangerous pitch. We were no longer flying a jet. We were trapped in a falling lead pipe. I watched the altitude indicator spin toward the dark ocean below. The pilot struggled with the flight controls, his pistol forgotten on the deck. He needed both hands to keep us from a terminal stall. I saw my chance to end this geographic shell game once and for all. I reached for the pilot's headset and dialed the emergency frequency. The Federal interceptors were still trailing us at a distance. I gave them our exact coordinates and confirmed the mid-air data theft. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and terrifying. They were authorized to use force if the data breach became a national security risk. I realized then that I was a secondary target in their eyes. The government didn't want to save me, they wanted to erase the leak. 2 minutes to impact. The pilot shouted over the roar of the wind. I buckled myself into the nearest seat and held the titanium drive. The black helicopter peeled away, its mission compromised by the interceptor's arrival. They weren't willing to die for Dominic's stolen brilliance. I saw the flare of a heat-seeking missile from the horizon. The Federal jets were making a choice for me. They were going to destroy the evidence before it hit the water. My pulse hammered in my freezing ears. I watched the missile's exhaust trail cut through the purple dawn. The pilot managed to level the wings, but we were still dropping fast. I looked at the secondary trigger Beverly had warned me about. If I activated the escrow now, the Federal jets might see the signal. It would prove the data was locked and no longer a threat. I jammed the titanium key into my laptop and hit the override. A bright blue light pulsed from the jet's external antenna. The missile swerved. The projectile exploded 500 yards out, sending a shockwave through the cabin. The pilot used the momentum to pull the nose up into a glide. We were going to hit the water, but we were going to survive. I clutched the drive to my chest, my eyes fixed on the waves. The interceptors circled above us like hungry hawks. I realized the Macau decoy had served one final purpose. By refusing to let the data reach the wrong hands even in a crash, I forced the government to admit that only I could manage the Sentinel shield technology safely. We hit the ocean with a bone-jarring impact that shattered the landing gear. Cold salt water poured into the cabin, rising quickly around my waist. I scrambled for the emergency raft as the pilot kicked the exit door open. He didn't look back as he inflated the yellow slide. I followed him out into the freezing swells, the titanium drive safe in my pocket. As the jet sank, I saw a Federal cutter approaching from the east. My work was safe, but I was still a prisoner. The cutter's hull loomed over our yellow raft like a steel mountain. Salt spray stung my eyes as a rope ladder dropped toward us. The pilot climbed first, his hands bound by a sailor as soon as he reached the deck. I followed, clutching my waterproof bag with a white, knuckled grip. A woman in a dark windbreaker stepped forward, her face etched with cold authority. She didn't offer a towel or a kind word. She just pointed toward the titanium drive bulging in my pocket. The escrow period officially began 60 seconds ago, she stated. Her voice was flat, cutting through the roar of the ocean. My heart sank as she explained the new reality of my life. Because the data had nearly left domestic airspace, the technology was now classified as a Tier 1 asset. I was no longer just the owner, I was a custodian of a state secret. My freedom depended on whether I could prove the mirror sites were dead. One leak would end my career forever. They led me into a small, windowless tactical room inside the ship. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and stale coffee. I placed my laptop on the metal table and connected the drive. A bank of monitors flickered to life, showing the status of the Macau and Vancouver servers. The Vancouver site was still pulsing with a low, level heartbeat signal. Someone was trying to wake the system from the outside. I realized the Macau decoy had actually worked too well. The federal lead, Agent Miller, leaned over my shoulder as I worked. She wanted to know why the Vancouver site was still active. I explained that Dominic must have used a physical dead man switch. If he didn't check in every 12 hours, the system would initiate a public broadcast. It was his final insurance policy against his own father and me. If I didn't stop the timer, my $1.2 billion patent would become open source code. The Scott family's greed had turned into global sabotage. I had exactly 22 minutes to reach the Vancouver route directory. The ship's satellite link was struggling with the heavy swells and storm clouds. Every time the hold dipped, the connection speed plummeted to 0. I felt a surge of panic as the progress bar stalled at 10%. Miller watched the clock with a predatory focus that made my skin itch. She held a red phone, ready to call for a total digital wipe. A wipe would destroy the code and my legacy. I need more bandwidth or we lose it all, I snapped. Miller signaled to a technician, who began reorienting the ship's primary dish. The humming of the motors vibrated through the floor under my boots. I watched the signal's strength climb, line by painful line. The subtext of the room was clear: I was being tested. If I failed to control my own creation, the government would take it. The power balance shifted as the Vancouver terminal finally accepted my remote credentials. I navigated through the sub-directories until I found the blackmail file. It was a secondary copy, hidden behind a decoy encryption layer. Dominic hadn't just blackmailed developers, he had recorded the board of directors. Every bribe and illegal backdoor deal was documented in high-definition video files. This was the reason Beverly Anders was so terrified of the truth. The entire Redwood corporate structure was built on a foundation of digital extortion. I stared at the names, my hands trembling with cold. Download the evidence and kill the switch, Miller ordered. I initiated the transfer. Watching the file names scroll past on the screen. The board members were seen discussing the manual forgery of my signature. They knew the dual authentication was a legal barrier and chose to break it. The video showed Richard Scott laughing as he handed Dominic a counterfeit biometric scanner. My life's work was treated like a toy by men who couldn't understand its true power. The timer hit 0. The screen flashed a warning before turning a deep, calm blue. The dead man switch had been neutralized just as the final packet arrived. I leaned back in the plastic chair, my breath hitching in my chest. Miller took the drive and sealed it in a lined evidence bag. She looked at me with a newfound respect that felt like ice. I was clear of the fraud. But I was still bound to the government. The escrow was now a fortress, not a prison. We reached the Vancouver docks just as the sun began to set. I watched from the deck as federal agents swarmed the data center. The Redwood name was being scrubbed from the internet in real time. I turned to Miller and asked if I could finally go home. She handed me a new phone with a single contact already programmed in. It was the Department of Defense. I realized then that my journey back to the boardroom had just become a war. The cold Vancouver air bit through my damp clothes as I stepped off the cutter. Agent Miller handed me a folder containing a temporary operating license. The escrow was a cage, but this paper was a small door. I looked at the new phone she provided, its screen glowing with military-grade encryption. My objective was simple: reclaim my identity and build a new home for my technology. I turned away from the docks and saw a familiar silver sedan waiting. Tanner Cooper sat inside. Tanner looked older in the harsh streetlights, but his eyes remained sharp and clear. He handed me a warm coat and a thermos of black coffee. We drove in silence toward a small, nondescript office building by the waterfront. He revealed that he had used his retirement funds to secure a short-term lease. The name on the glass door was already set: I. Benson Security Technologies. It felt real for the first time. I realized that my worth was finally detached from the Redwood name. Inside the office, the air smelled of fresh paint and new hardware. 4 workstations sat ready, their monitors dark and waiting for my touch. Tanner explained that Ethan and the other blackmailed developers were already on their way. We were rebuilding the original team from the ashes of the Scott legacy. The primary obstacle was the 90-day government freeze on my main patents. We had to innovate around our own locked code to survive the first quarter. This was a technical marathon. I opened my laptop and began mapping out the next generation of Sentinel Shield. The subtext of the room was one of quiet, focused rebellion against corporate greed. We were no longer employees. We were architects of our own destiny. Tanner watched me work, a proud smile touching his lips. He mentioned that the Department of Defense was already requesting a formal briefing. Our tiny startup was the most powerful player in the room. Then, a high priority alert flashed on my secure phone screen. The message was from the federal prosecutor handling the Scott case. Dominic had vanished during a supervised medical transfer after the plane crash. The hospital room was empty, the guards found unconscious. He was no longer in custody, and his personal accounts were being drained. I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. The black helicopter from the ocean wasn't just a retrieval team. It was a getaway vehicle for a man with nothing left to lose. Dominic was out there, and he still had his resentment. I looked at the silver titanium key, sitting on the desk between us. The secrets it held were dangerous enough to kill. Dominic knew exactly where I would go to rebuild my life. I walked to the window and scanned the dark street for any unfamiliar shadows. The victory felt suddenly fragile and temporary. My patent was worth over $1 billion, but my life was now the primary target. I reached for the light switch and plunged the new office into darkness. The war wasn't over.